This audio is from the book John Pilger, The New Rules of the World, on the chapter Paying the Price. We do not seek the destruction of Iraq, nor do we seek to punish the Iraqi people for the decisions and policies of their leaders. President George Bush Sr. We think the price is worth it. US Ambassador Madeleine Albright, when asked if the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were a price worth paying for sanctions. They know we own their country. We dictate the way they live and talk, and that's what's great about America right now. It's a good thing, especially when there's a lot of oil out there that we need. Brigadier General William Looney, US Air Force, Director of the bombings of Iraq. Wherever you go in Iraq's southern city of Basra, there is dust. It rolls down the long roads that are the desert's fingers. It gets in your eyes and nose and throat. It swirls in markets and school playgrounds, consuming children kicking a plastic ball. And it carries, according to Dr. Jawad Al-Ahli, the seeds of our death. Dr. Al-Ali is a cancer specialist at the City Hospital and a member of Britain's Royal College of Physicians. He has a neat moustache and a kindly furrowed face. His starched white coat, like the collar of his shirt, is frayed. Before the Gulf War, we had only 3 or 4 deaths in a month from cancer, he said. Now it's 30 to 35 patients dying every month, and that's just in my department. That is 12 times the increase in the cancer mortality. Our studies indicate that 40 to 48% of the population in this area will get cancer. In 5 years' time to begin with, then long afterwards. That's almost half the population. Most of my own family now have cancer, and we have no history of the disease. It has spread to the medical staff of this hospital. Yesterday, the son of the medical director died. We don't know the precise source of the contamination because we are not allowed to get the equipment to conduct a proper survey or even test the excess levels of radiation in our bodies. We strongly suspect depleted uranium, which was used by the Americans and British in the Gulf War, right across the southern battlefields. Whatever the cause, it is like Chernobyl here. The genetic effects are new to us. The mushrooms grow huge and the fish in what was once a beautiful river are inedible. Even the grapes in my garden have mutated and can't be eaten. Along the corridor, I met Dr. Ginan Ghalib Hassan, a paediatrician. At another time, she might have been described as an effervescent personality. Now she too has a melancholy expression that does not change. It is the face of Iraq. This is Ali Rafa Aswaldi, she said, stopping to take the hand of a wasted boy I guessed to be about 4 years old. He is 9 years, she said. He has leukemia. Now we can't treat him. Only some of the drugs are available. We get drugs for 2 or 3 weeks and then they stop when the shipments stop. Unless you continue a course, the treatment is useless. We can't even give blood transfusions because there are not enough blood bags. In the next bed, a child lay in his shrouded mother's arms. One side of his head was severely swollen. This is neuroblastoma, said Dr. Hassan. It is a very unusual tumour. Before 1991, we saw only 1 case of this tumour in 2 years. Now we have many cases. Another child has his eyes fixed on me, and I asked what would happen to him. She said, he has an abdominal mass. We have operated on him, but unless the tumour receives treatment, it will recur. We have only some drugs. We are waiting for the full course. He has renal failure now, so his future is bad. All the futures here are bad. Dr. Hassan keeps a photo album of the children she is trying to save and has been unable to save. This is Talam Salah, she said, turning to a photograph of a boy in a blue pullover and with sparkling eyes. He is 5.5 years old. This is a case of Hodgkin's disease. Normally with Hodgkin's, a patient can expect to live and the cure can be 95%, but if the drugs are not available, complications set in and death follows. This boy had a beautiful nature. He died. I said, as we were walking, I noticed you stop and put your face to the wall. Yes, I was emotional. I am a doctor. I am not supposed to cry, but I cry every day, because this is torture. These children could live. They could live and grow up, and when you see your son and daughter in front of you dying, what happens to you? I said, what do you say to those in the West who deny the connection between depleted uranium and the deformities of these children? That is not true. How much proof do they want? There is every relation between congenital malformation and depleted uranium. Before 1991, we saw nothing like this at all. If there is no connection, why have these things not happened before? Most of these children have no family history of cancer. I have studied what happened in Hiroshima. It is almost exactly the same here. We have an increased percentage of congenital malformation, an increase of malignancy, leukemia, brain tumours, the same. Under the economic embargo imposed by the United Nations Security Council in 1990 and upgraded the following year, Iraqis denied equipment and expertise to decontaminate its battlefields, in contrast to how Kuwait was cleaned up after the Gulf War. The US Army physicist responsible for cleaning up Kuwait was Professor Doug Roke, whom I met in London. Today he himself is a victim. I am like many people in southern Iraq, he said. I have 5,000 times the recommended level of radiation in my body. The contamination was right through Iraq and Kuwait. With the munitions testings and preparations in Saudi Arabia, uranium contamination covers the entire region. The effect depends on whether a person inhaled it or ingested it by eating and drinking, or if they got it in an open wound. What we're seeing now, respiratory problems, kidney problems, cancers, are the direct result of the use of this highly toxic material. The controversy over whether or not it's a cause it's a manufactured one, my own ill health is testament to that. Professor Roke says there are two urgent issues to be confronted by people in the West. Those with a sense of right and wrong, first, the decision by the United States and Britain to use a weapon of mass destruction, such as depleted uranium, he said. In the Gulf War, well over 300 tons were fired. An A-10 Warthog attack aircraft fired over 900,000 rounds. Each individual round was 300 grams of solid uranium-238. When a tank fired its shells, each round carried over 4,500 grams of solid uranium. These rounds are not coated, they're not tipped, they're solid uranium. Moreover, we have evidence to suggest that they were mixed with plutonium. What happened in the Gulf was a form of nuclear warfare. The second issue is the denial of medical care to American and British and other Allied soldiers and the tens of thousands of Iraqis contaminated. At international symposiums, I have watched Iraqi officials approach their counterparts from the Department of Defence and the Ministry of Defence and plead for help with decontamination. The Iraqis didn't use depleted uranium, it was not their weapon. They simply don't know how to get rid of it from their environment. I watched them put their case describing the deaths and the horrific deformities that are showing up, and I watched them rebuffed. It was pathetic. The United Nations Sanctions Committee in New York, dominated by the Americans and British, has vetoed or delayed a range of vital medical equipment, chemotherapy drugs, even painkillers. In the jargon of denial, blocked equals vetoed, and on hold means delayed or may be blocked. In Baghdad, I sat in a clinic as doctors received parents and their children, many of them grey-skinned and bald, some of them dying, after every second or third examination. Dr. Leka Fessa Alzir, the young oncologist, wrote in English, "No drugs available." I asked her to jot down in my notebook a list of drugs the hospital had ordered but had not received, or had received intermittently. She filled a page. I had been filming in Iraq for my documentary, Paying the Price, Killing the Children of Iraq. Back in London, I showed Dr. Alzir's list to Professor Carol Sikora, who, as chief of the cancer programme of the World Health Organization, wrote in the British Medical Journal and requested radiotherapy equipment, chemotherapy drugs and analgesics are consistently blocked by United States and British advisors to the Sanctions Committee. There seems to be a rather ludicrous notion that such agents could be converted into chemical and other weapons. He told me, nearly all these drugs are available in every British hospital. They are very standard. When I came back from Iraq last year with a group of experts, I drew up a list of 17 drugs that are deemed essential for cancer treatment. We informed the UN that there was no possibility of converting these drugs into chemical warfare agents. We heard nothing more. The saddest thing I saw in Iraq was children dying because there was no chemotherapy and no pain control. It seemed crazy that they couldn't have morphine because for everybody with cancer pain, it is the best drug. When I was there, they had a little bottle of aspirin pills to go around 200 patients in pain. They would receive a particular anti-cancer drug, but then get only little bits of drugs here and there, and so you can't have any planning. It's bizarre. I told him that one of the doctors had been especially upset because the UN Sanctions Committee had banned nitrous oxide as weapons dual use. Yet this was used in caesarean sections to stop bleeding and perhaps save a mother's life. I can see no logic to banning it. He said, I am not an armaments expert, but the amounts used would be so small that even if you collected all the drug supply for the whole nation and pooled it, it is difficult to see how you could make any chemical warfare device out of it. I asked him how criticisms were received by the World Health Organization. We were specifically told not to talk about it afterwards, about the whole Iraq business. The WHO was embarrassed. It's not an organisation that likes to get involved in politics. Mohammed Ghani's studio in Baghdad is dominated by a huge crucifix he is sculpturing for the Church of the Assumption in Baghdad. As Iraq's most famous sculptor, he is proud that the Vatican has commissioned him, a Muslim, to sculpture the Stations of the Cross in Rome, a cultural acknowledgement, he says, of his country as Mesopotamia, the cradle of Western civilization. When I visited him, Mozart was playing on his venerable tape deck, which perched on a refrigerator of similar vintage, and in which were 2 small bottles of beer. He handed me one. Here's to life, and no more sorrow, please, he said. His latest work is a 20-foot high figure of a woman, her child gripping her legs, pleading for food. Every morning I see her, he said, waiting with others just like her in a long line at the hospital at the end of my road. He has produced a line of figurines that depict their waiting. All the heads are bowed before a door that is permanently closed. The door is the dispensary, he said, but it is also the world, kept shut by those who rule the world. The next day I saw the same line of women and children at the Al Mansour's Children's Hospital. Their doctor's anguish had a terrible echo. Children with meningitis can survive with a precise dosage of antibiotics, said Dr. Mohammed Maham. 4 milligrams can save a life, but so often we are allowed only 1 milligram. This is a teaching hospital, but children die because we are not allowed parts for machines that separate blood platelets. It was here, as we walked along the line of people waiting, that my companion, Dennis Halliday, had an extraordinary reunion. A courtly Irishman who the previous year, 1998, had resigned as the UN's coordinator of humanitarian relief to Iraq in protest against the effects of the embargo on the civilian population, he had returned with me to Baghdad. Now he spotted a man and his daughter, and the three erupted with greetings. Safa, he said, dropping to his knees to take the hands of a 9-year-old girl. John, this is Safa Majid and her father, Majid Ali. Safa I met 2 years ago in this hospital when I was the UN chief in Iraq, and she was in a very poor condition with leukemia. One cannot deal with thousands, but one can deal with 2 or 3 or 4 children. And I was able, with the help of the World Health Organization, to bring in drugs on the quiet. They were enough for 2 years of treatment for this little girl. And today, look at her. She looks wonderful, and her father says she's only to come up once a month now. So I think she's almost cured of the leukemia. Safa was one of 4 I helped. 2 little girls died. Why did they die? They died because the medications were not available. And when you set out to help these children, you were the United Nations representative here. That's right. And to help them, I had to act illegally. I had to breach my own economic sanctions, so to speak, established by the Security Council, led by Washington and London. In this hospital, we have seen the evidence today of the killing that is now the responsibility of the Security Council member states, particularly Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. They should be here with us. They should see the impact of what their decisions and their sustaining of economic sanctions mean. The very provisions of the Charter of the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights are being set aside. We are waging a war through the United Nations on the children and people of Iraq, and with incredible results that you do not expect to see in a war under the Geneva Conventions. We're targeting civilians. Worse, we're targeting children like Safa, who of course were not born when Iraq went into Kuwait. What is this about? It is a monstrous situation for the United Nations, for the Western world, for all of us who are part of some democratic system, who are in fact responsible for the policies of our governments and the implementation of economic sanctions on Iraq. Dennis Halliday had resigned after 34 years with the UN. He was then Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations with a long and distinguished career in development, attempting to help people, not harm them. His was the first public expression of an unprecedented rebellion within the UN bureaucracy. I am resigning, he wrote, because the policy of economic sanctions is totally bankrupt. We are in the process of destroying an entire society. It is as simple as that. 5,000 children are dying every month. I don't want to administer a programme that results in figures like this. Since I met Halliday, I have been struck by the principle behind his carefully chosen, uncompromising words. I had been instructed, he said, to implement a policy that satisfies the definition of genocide, a deliberate policy that has effectively killed well over 1 million individuals, children and adults. We all know that the regime Saddam Hussein is not paying the price for economic sanctions. On the contrary, he has been strengthened by them. It is the little people are losing their children or their parents for lack of untreated water. What is clear is that the Security Council is now out of control, for its actions here undermine its own charter and the Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Convention. History will slaughter those responsible. In the UN, Halliday broke a long collective silence. On February 13, 2000, Hans von Sponeck, who had succeeded him as humanitarian coordinator in Baghdad, resigned. Like Halliday, he had been with the UN for more than 30 years. How long, he asked, should the civilian population of Iraq be exposed to such punishment for something they have never done? 2 days later, Jutta Burghardt, head of the World Food Programme in Iraq, another UN agency, resigned, saying that she too could no longer tolerate what was being done to the Iraqi people. When I met von Sponeck in Baghdad in October 1999, the anguish behind his measured, self-effacing exterior was evident. Like Halliday's, his job had been to administer the so-called Oil for Food programme, which since 1996 has allowed Iraq to sell a fraction of its oil for money that goes straight to an account controlled by the Security Council. Almost a third is not used on humanitarian aid but pays the UN's expenses, as well as reparations demanded by Kuwait, one of the world's wealthiest nations, and compensation claims by oil companies and other multinational corporations. Iraq must then tender on the international market for food and medical supplies and other humanitarian resources. Every contract has to be approved by the UN Sanctions Committee in New York. When sanctions were imposed following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, all imports, including food, were effectively banned for 8 months, even though Security Council Resolution 661 on August 6, 1990 explicitly exempted food and medicines. For a year, the UN refused to allow Iraq the means of raising funds beyond its exhausted cash reserves. As Iraq imported almost everything, the effect was immediate and devastating, compounded by the results of a bombing campaign designed to cripple the civilian infrastructure. US military planners, reported the Washington Post, hoped the bombing would amplify the economic and psychological impact of international sanctions on Iraqi society. Because of these goals, damage to civilian structures and interests, invariably described by briefers during the war of collateral and unintended, was sometimes neither. The worst civilian suffering, senior officers say, has resulted not from bombs that went astray, but from precision-guided weapons that had hit exactly where they were aimed, at electrical plants, oil refineries, and transportation networks. Among the justifications offered is that Iraq's civilians were not blameless. A senior Air Force officer said, "They do live there." Reporting on the aftermath of the bombing, UN Under-Secretary General Marty Atisari describes the near apocalyptic state of the country's basic services. Iraq has for some time to come been relegated to a pre-industrial age, he wrote, but with all the disabilities of post-industrial dependency on an intensive use of energy and technology. A Harvard University study team concluded that Iraq was heading for a public health catastrophe, with tens of thousands of deaths by the end of 1991 alone, the majority of them young children. The team of independent American professionals and academics estimated that during the first 8 months of sanctions, with all shipments of food and medicines were blockaded, 47,000 children under the age of 5 had died. The administration of George Bush Sr. appeared to concur with these assessments, and yet, wrote Dr. Eric Herring of Bristol University, a sanction specialist, comprehensive economic sanctions remained in place. These policy makers who backed these sanctions cannot say that they did not know what was going to happen. Whatever the political purpose, it was a conscious and callous choice to deny an entire society the means necessary to survive. In 1991, the Security Council, in its Resolution 687, stated that if Iraq renounced weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, or ballistic missiles with a range of more than 150 kilometres, and agreed to monitoring by a UN Special Commission in Iraq, UNESCOM, the embargo would be lifted. In 1998, UNESCOM reported that despite Iraqi obstruction in some areas, the disarmament phase of the Security Council's requirements is possibly near its end in the missile and chemical weapons area. On December the 15th, 1998, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that it had eliminated Iraq's nuclear weapons program efficiently and effectively. Scott Ritter, for 5 years a senior UNESCOM weapons inspector, agreed by 1998 the chemical weapons infrastructure had been completely dismantled or destroyed by UNESCOM or by Iraq in compliance with our mandate, he told me. The biological weapons program was gone, all the major facilities eliminated. The nuclear weapons program was completely eliminated. The long-range ballistic missile program was completely eliminated. If I had to quantify Iraq's threat, I would say it is zero. While food and medicines are technically exempt, the Sanctions Committee has frequently vetoed and delayed requests for baby food, agriculture equipment, heart and cancer drugs, oxygen tents, X-ray machines, 16 heart and lung machines were put on hold because they contained computer chips. A fleet of ambulances was held up because their equipment included vacuum flasks, which keep medical supplies cold. Vacuum flasks are designated dual use by the Sanctions Committee, meaning they could possibly be used in weapons manufacture. Cleaning materials such as chlorine are dual use, as is the graphite used in pencils, as are wheelbarrows, it seems, considering the frequency of their appearance on the list of holds. As of October 2001, 1,010 contracts for humanitarian supplies worth $3.85 billion were on hold by the Sanctions Committee. They included items related to food, health, water and sanitation, agriculture and education. Most members of the Security Council want the sanctions eased considerably or lifted. The French have called them cruel, ineffective and dangerous. However, American dominance of the Council is such that the US and British representatives on the Sanctions Committee allow, veto and delay contracts. The British claim they hold up only 1% of humanitarian contracts. This is sophistry. By never objecting to American obstruction, they give it tacit support. Moreover, a veto or hold can only be rescinded by the Council member who orders it. So blatant is the obstruction that Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General virtually appointed by the Americans, complained that delays and vetoes were seriously impairing the effective implementation of the Oil for Food programme. He urged the approval of water, sanitation and electricity contracts without delay, because of their paramount importance to the welfare of the Iraqi people. The Executive Director of the UN Office of the Iraq Programme, Benon Savan, has attacked the Council for holding up spares for Iraq's crumbling oil industry, warning that the less oil Iraq is able to pump, the less money will be available to buy food and medicine. In 1999, a senior Clinton administration official told the Washington Post, "The longer we can fool around in the Security Council and keep things static, the better." In Britain, customs and excise have stopped parcels going to Iraqi relatives containing children's clothes and toys. The chairman of the British Library, John Ashworth, wrote to Harry Cohen MP that, after consultation with the Foreign Office, it was decided that books could no longer be sent to Iraqi students. The British Library had already distinguished itself by informing a translator in Baghdad that it was not permitted to send him a copy of James Joyce's Ulysses. From the petty and craven to the farcical, an attempt to send documents to Iraq advising Iraqis on human rights and press freedom, was blocked by the Department of Trade and Industry in London. The package, which also contained advice on family planning and AIDS, was posted to Mosul University but was intercepted and returned to Article 19, the anti-censorship group. When Dennis Halliday was a senior United Nations official in Iraq, a display cabinet stood in the foyer of his office. It contained a bag of wheat, some congealed cooking oil, bars of soap, and a few other household necessities. It was a pitiful sight, he said, and it represented the monthly rations that we were allowed to spend. I added cheese to lift the protein content, but there was simply not enough money left over from the amount we were allowed to spend, which came from the revenue Iraq was allowed to make from its oil. He describes food shipments as an exercise in duplicity. A shipment that the Americans claims allows for 2,300 calories per person per day may well allow for only 2,000 calories or fewer. What's missing, he said, will be animal proteins, minerals and vitamins. As most Iraqis have no other source of income, food has become a medium of exchange. It gets sold for other necessities, further lowering the calorie intake. You also have to get clothes and shoes for your kids to go to school. You've then got malnourished mothers who cannot breastfeed and then pick up bad water. What is needed is investment in water treatment and distribution, electric power, production for food processing, storage and refrigeration, education and agriculture. His successor, Hans von Sponeck, calculates that the Oil for Food program allows $100 for each person to live on for a year. This figure also has to help pay for the entire society's infrastructure and essential services, such as power and water. It is simply not possible to live on such an amount. Once Sponeck told me, see that pittance against the lack of clean water, the fact that electricity fails for up to 22 hours a day, and the majority of sick people cannot afford treatment, and the sheer trauma of trying to get from day to day. And you have a glimpse of the nightmare, and make no mistake, this is deliberate. I have not in the past wanted to use the word genocide, but now it is unavoidable. The cost in lives is staggering. A study by the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, found that between 1991 and 1998, there were 500,000 deaths above the anticipated rate among Iraqi children under 5 years of age. This on average is 5,200 preventable under 5 deaths per month. Hans von Sponeck said some 167 Iraqi children are dying every day. Dennis Halliday said, if you include adults, the figure is now almost certainly well over 1 million. In 1999, a humanitarian panel set up by the Security Council reported that Iraq had slipped from relative affluence prior to 1991 into massive poverty. The panel criticised the Oil for Food programme as inadequate to remedy a dire humanitarian situation that cannot be overstated. The panel's members took the remarkable step of attacking their sponsor, charging that the Iraqi people would not be undergoing such deprivations in the absences of the prolonged measures imposed by the Security Council. Once again, children were found to be the main victims, with the infant mortality rate soaring from one of the lowest in the world in 1990 to the highest. In a separate study, Richard Garfield, a renowned epidemiologist at Columbia University in New York, says that in tripling since 1990, the death rate of children in Iraq is unique. There is almost no documented case, he wrote, of rising mortality for children under 5 years in the modern world. Extrapolating from these statistics, American researchers John Mueller and Carl Mueller conclude that economic sanctions have probably already taken the lives of more people in Iraq than have been killed by all weapons of mass destruction in history. In 1999, 70 members of the US Congress signed an unusually blunt letter to President Clinton appealing to him to lift the embargo and end what they called infanticide, masquerading as policy. The Clinton administration had already given them their reply. In 1996, an infamous interview on the American current affairs program 60 Minutes Madeleine Albright, then US Ambassador to the United Nations, had been asked, "We have heard that 500,000 children have died. Is the price worth it?" Albright replied, "I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." My journey to Iraq was almost surreal. With Dennis Halliday and my television colleagues Alan Lowry, Preston Clothier and Grant Roberts, I spent 16 anxious hours on a road that is a ribbon of wreckage. Pieces of tyre drifted towards us like giant blackbirds escaping the squalls of sand and dust. Beside the road lay two bodies. They were old men in suits, as if laid out for their funeral, their arms stiffly by their sides. A taxi rested upside down. The men had been walking to the border, each with his meagre belongings, now scattered among the thorn bushes. The taxi's brakes had apparently failed and it had cut them down. Local people came out of the dust, stood beside the bodies. For them, on this, the only road in and out of Iraq, it was a common sight. The road from Amman in Jordan to Baghdad was never meant as an artery, yet it now carries most of Iraq's permissible trade and traffic to the outside world. Two narrow single lanes are dominated by oil tankers, moving in an endless convoy, cars and overladen buses and vans dart in and out in a dance macabre. The inevitable carnage provides a roadside tableau of burnt-out tankers, a bus crushed like a tin can, an official United Nations Mercedes on its side, its once privileged occupants dead. Of course, brakes fail on a rickety taxis everywhere, but the odds against survival here are greatly shortened. Parts for the older models are now non-existent, and drivers go through the night and day with little sleep. With the Iraqi diner worth virtually nothing, they must go back and forth from Baghdad to Amman to Baghdad, as frequently and as quickly as possible. And when they and their passengers are killed or maimed, they too become victims of the most ruthless economic embargo of modern times. Baghdad was just visible beneath a white pall of pollution. Young arms reached up to the window of our van. A boy offering an overripe banana, a girl a single stem flower. Before 1990, begging was almost unknown and frowned upon. Baghdad today is an urban version of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The birds have gone as avenues of palms have died in what was once the land of dates. The splashes of colour on fruit stalls are three-dimensional. A bunch of dull bananas and a bag of apples from Beirut cost a teacher's salary for a month. Only foreigners and the rich eat fruit. The rich, the black marketeers, the regime's cronies and favoured supplicants are not visible, except for an occasional tinted glass late model Mercedes, navigating its way through the rust buckets. Having been ordered to keep their heads down, the elite keep to their network of clubs and restaurants and well-stocked clinics, the presence of which make nonsense of claims in Washington and London that the sanctions are hurting the regime. The Al Rashid Hotel is where Saddam Hussein's people are glimpsed. Dark glasses, large dyed moustaches, and spooks proliferate. You enter by way of an icon of dark Iraqi humour, crossing a large floor portrait set in tiles of George Bush Sr., a good likeness, and the words "George Bush is a war criminal." The face is forever being polished. I met an assistant manager who had been at the hotel since the 1980s, and whose sardonic sense of Western double standards was a treat. "Ah, a journalist from Britain," he said. "Would you like to see where Mr. Douglas Hurd stayed, and Mr. David Mellon, and Mr. Tony Newton, and all the other members of Mrs. Thatcher's government? These gentlemen were our friends, our benefactors." He has a collection of the Baghdad Observers from the good old days. Saddam Hussein is on the front page, where he always is. The only change in each photograph is that he's sitting on his white presidential couch with a different British government minister, who is smiling or wincing. There is Douglas Hurd in 1981, then a Foreign Office Minister, who came to sell Saddam Hussein a British aerospace missile system, and to celebrate the anniversary of the coming to power of the Ba'ath Redemption Party, a largely CIA triumph in 1968 that extinguished all hopes of a pluralistic Iraq and produced Saddam Hussein. There is heard twice on the couch and on page 2, bowing before the tyrant, the renowned interrogator and torturer of Qasr al-Nihaya, the Palace of the End. And there is the corpulent David Mellor, also a Foreign Office man, on the same white couch in 1998. While Mellor, or Mr. Mellon, as the assistant manager preferred, was being entertained, his host ordered the gassing of 5,000 Kurds in the town of Halabja, news of which the Foreign Office tried to suppress. And there is Tony Newton, Margaret Thatcher's Trade Secretary, who within a month of the gassing of the Kurds was on the same white couch offering Saddam 340 million of British taxpayers' money in export credits. And there he is again, 3 months later, back on the couch, celebrating the fact that Iraq was now Britain's third largest market for machine tools, from which a range of weapons was forged. As the subsequent inquiry by Sir Richard Scott revealed, these celebrities of the Baghdad Observer knew they were dealing illegally with a tyrant. "Please give Mr. Mellor my greetings," said the assistant manager. Read carefully, history will usually offer an explanation. A few miles from Al-Rashid is a cemetery girded by iron railings, behind which lines of stone crosses are just visible through drifting skeins of dust and sand. This is the British cemetery where soldiers who fought the Turks near the end of the First World War are buried. "Here have been recovered or interred," says a plaque, "the bodies of British officers and men who after the fall of Kut, being prisoners in the hands of the Turks, perished. These are they who came out of great tribulation." Private F.R. Reynolds of the Imperial Camel Corps was 19 when he was killed on October the 11th, 1918. His cross has crumbled. Frederick Ivor Hessiger, 2nd Lieutenant Royal Field Artillery, was 20 when he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Châtelham on April 30th, 1917. Being the eldest son of the 3rd Baron Chelmsford, Viceroy of India, he has his own tomb, which Weirds and Boynes have claimed. None of the inscriptions says he died to secure a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. That was how the US State Department in 1945 described the oil fields of the Middle East. After oil was discovered in the late 19th century, the European powers lost no time in getting their hands on the greatest prize. By 1918, they had seen off the Ottoman Turks and divided up their empire. Iraq and all the Arab lands became colonies, despite earlier promises of independence after the war. France kept Syria, Lebanon and northern Iraq. Britain seized Baghdad and Basra in the south. The long-suffering Kurds were kept in a separate region under the British, and when they rose up, Winston Churchill, the colonial secretary, mused, "I do not understand this squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favour of using poison gas against uncivilised tribes." Having crowned a puppet Iraqi king, Faisal, the British set about destroying the independent movement by pulverising villages with artillery and bombarding farmlands with phosphorus bombs and metal crow's feet designed to maim livestock. Iraq, source of the world's highest grade oil, remained a British colony in all but name until the Suez invasion in 1956. 2 years later, the Iraqi monarchy was overthrown by a nationalist, Abd al-Karim Qasim, who himself fell victim to an internecine struggle. The new regime called itself an Arab Socialist Union, and a measure of plurality included a decentralised administration and recognition of the Kurdish language and national identity. When the Iraq Petroleum Company, the foreign consortium that exploited Iraq's oil, was threatened with nationalisation in 1963, the new imperial power, the United States, engineered what the Central Intelligence Agency called its favourite coup. We regarded it as great victory, says James Critchfield, then head of the CIA in the Middle East. The Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party, Ali Salah Saadi, concurred. We came to power on a CIA train, he said, thereafter instigating a reign of terror that produced Saddam Hussein, who became the top man in 1979. He was America's man. Saddam has a great deal to thank the CIA for, said Aburish, his biographer told me. He can thank them for beginning the Ba'ath Party to power, for helping him personally, for providing him with financial aid during the war with Iran, for protecting him against internal coups of the Tet. It's a continuing relationship from the early 1960s until now, and it's a love-hate relationship. So enduring was America's ardor, or rather its gratitude to Iraq for protecting its client Arab states from Iran's revolutionary virus, that Saddam Hussein was given everything he wanted, almost up until the day he invaded Kuwait in August 1990. When John Kelly, the US Assistant Secretary of State, visited Baghdad in 1989, he told him, "You are a force for moderation in the region, and the United States wants to broaden her relationship with Iraq." The force for moderation had just claimed victory in a war against Iran, which resulted in more than 1 million casualties on both sides, dead and wounded. When human rights groups presented evidence that Saddam Hussein had used mustard gas and nerve gas against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, the State Department refused to condemn him. As Saddam Hussein was preparing his forces for the attack on his southern neighbour, a US Department of Energy official discovered that advanced nuclear reactors were being shipped to Iraq. When he alerted his superiors, he was moved to another job. "We knew about their bomb program," said a former member of the British administration, "but Saddam was our ally." In 1992, a congressional inquiry found that President George Bush Sr. and his top advisors had ordered a cover-up to conceal their secret support for Saddam Hussein and the illegal arms shipments being sent to him via third countries. Missile technology was shipped to South Africa and Chile and then on-sold to Iraq, while Commerce Department records were altered and deleted. This mirrored the emerging scandal across the Atlantic, which saw British weapons technology being illegally shipped to Iraq, with Jordan listed on the end-user certificates. Within weeks of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the CIA was still feeding copious intelligence to Baghdad. Congressman Henry Gonzalez, chairman of the House of Representatives Banking Committee, said Bush and his advisors financed, equipped, and secured the monster that later set out to slay, and they were now burying the evidence. A 1994 Senate report documented the transfer to Iraq of the ingredients of biological weapons. Botulism developed at a company in Maryland, licensed by the Commerce Department and approved by the State Department. Anthrax was also supplied by the Porton-Dowan Laboratories in Britain, a government establishment. A congressional investigator said, "It was all money, it was all greed." The US government knew. The British government knew. Did they care? No. It was a competition with the Germans. That's how the arms trade works. During the parallel Scott inquiry in London into the arms to Iraq scandal, Tim Laxton, City of London auditor, was brought in to examine the books of the British arms company Astra, which the Thatcher government covertly and illegally used as a channel for arms to Iraq. Laxton was one of the few observers to sit through the entire inquiry. He believes that if Sir Richard Scott's brief had been open and unlimited, and Thatcher's senior aides and civil servants had been compelled to give evidence under oath, as well as numerous other vital witnesses who were not called, the outcome would have been very different from the temporary embarrassment meted out to a few ministers. Hundreds, he said, would have faced criminal investigation, including top political figures, very senior civil servants of the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Department of Trade, the top echelons of government. In the centre of Baghdad is a monolith that crowds the eye. It commemorates our celebrities, the 1980-90 Iran-Iraq War. It commemorates or celebrates the 1980-90 Iran-Iraq War, which Saddam Hussein started, urged on by the Americans who wanted him to destroy their new foe in the region, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Cast in a foundry in Basingstoke, its two huge forearms, reputedly modelled on Saddam Hussein's own, hold triumphant crossed sabres. Cars are allowed to drive over the helmets of dead Iranian soldiers embedded in the concourse. I cannot think of a site anywhere in the world that better expresses the crime of sacrificial war and the business of making and selling armaments, American and British, supplied both sides with weapons. We stayed at the Hotel Palestine, a far cry from the Al Rashid. The smell of petrol is constant,